Good afternoon and a really, really warm welcome to this Careers 2032 live event, the last of 5 events. So we've learned so many lessons from the first 4, so this is going to be absolutely spectacular, I've no doubt. Thank you all for joining us. My name's Debbie McVitie, I'm editor of Wonky, and I want to start by saying thank you so much to Handshake for involving us in this really fantastic project. And of course, thank you to all of you for making the time to come and join this second tranche. I'm going to ask each of my beautiful panelists to introduce themselves in their own words, starting with Fanny.
Hello, I am Fanny. I am a student at the Open University, studying part-time, and I'm also an elected rep as Vice President Engagement.
Steve Isherwood, so Chief Executive of Institute of Student Employers, so one of the participating organisations in this research. Pleased to be here.
Katie Gordon, Associate Director of Careers and Employability at Goldsmiths, University of London for now. And
I don't know how to follow that quite cryptic introduction. Claire Adams, Head of Education Strategy at Handshake.
Everyone asked Katie about her career plans after the session. So many of you will have been in the first tranche of this research, where we brought together across 5 cities roundtables of student representatives and SU professionals, employers, and careers professionals to talk about the next decade of career support for students and the big trends that we're going to be shaping that. You will all, I think, have seen the report that came out of that pulls out some of those trends. But when we were looking at the report and we were thinking, okay, this is really interesting, but what do we do about it? And actually, it became very clear that the thing to do was to kind of bring people together and to have the conversation against the backdrop of some of those findings, and think really hard and as tangibly as we possibly can. Really conscious, I think, that we're working against a backdrop of constrained resources across the piece, some real challenges for universities in terms of having to think about graduate outcomes, and some real challenges in terms of what's going on in the labour market, the pace of change, and the ever-increasing diversity of the student body. These are real challenges. They require collaboration, but we think we've got some really good minds here today to help us think through that. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a presentation from Claire, who's going to just cover off some of those key findings. We're going to have a bit of a panel discussion with our beautiful panel here. And then it's going to be over to you. We're going to spend a bit of time asking you to talk about and think about the implications of some of the findings that we've got so far for your institutions, for your context, for your organisations, and think really hard about what you would like to see in the next decade, what is going to be really important, what is going to shift the dial, what is going to make the difference to improving the quality of career support for students in the decade ahead. So I hope you are fettled and excited, because I know I am. And with that, I think we will crack on with Claire.
So for the first kind of 10, 15 minutes, we're going to focus on the student perspective specifically, because let's face it, that's why we're all here. Essentially, that's why we do what we do. But to give you a little bit of an insight into why the student first kind of mentality really matters for Handshake, and for me as well, I'm just going to share a few little insights into Handshake and into me first to start us off. So these are our company values, our Handshake company values. And as you can see, perhaps not surprisingly, for a company founded by students first is the first one on the list. And it's also the one that makes it onto the wall of the offices, which is nice. But as everyone in this room knows, values written on a slide, on a wall, on a piece of paper mean absolutely nothing, quite frankly, unless you do something about them, unless you bring them into decision making, unless you bring them into strategy, unless you bring them into hiring, into staff development. So that's what we try and do at Handshake every day. A little bit about why it matters to me personally, the student first mentality. I'm the first in my family to go to university. I did an arts and design degree. I do not work in art and design now, as you can probably gather as to why I'm here today. I realised very early on during my course that the career path that I was being taken on wasn't right for me. And I became lightly involved in the student union through course rep structures and things like that, and became really fascinated by the kind of transformative power of the educational experience as a whole. Fast forward a few years, and I was working in a student union where Andrew Wright was hanging around as well at the same time, as a democracy coordinator, which is the best job title I've ever had. It made me sound far more powerful than I actually was. And for anyone who has never worked in a student union, a democracy coordinator is essentially someone who organises elections and referenda and course rep structures and all that kind of stuff. So The student voice and the student experience has been a big part of my career for over the last decade. So just wanted to share that with you. A big part of my recent work has been sharing embarrassing photos of my colleagues in most of the presentations that I've done in the last 3 months. And so I'm going to continue that tradition today. It seems only fair with this audience. So on the next slide, we have a fabulous picture of our 3 founding students in what I assume was the first Handshake merchandise shoot, because they are all wearing Handshake hoodies. You will all get Handshake giddy bags on the way out, and our merchandise has moved on a little bit from these hoodies here. And this picture on the left is me in 2008, I think, at elections night at University of Arts London, announcing the results of the student union elections. So a little bit of fun, but also a little bit of an insight into why that student first mentality really matters for us, and why I'm really happy and honoured to be sharing the research today, but with that student kind of lens on. We're going to look at the student research through 3 different lenses, which will mirror what you'll be asked to discuss later on. There will be audience participation, as Debbie already alluded to. So we're going to look at it through the lenses of exploration, getting connected, and transitioning to work. Starting with exploration. And when we're talking about exploration here, we're talking about exploring the opportunities around students in their regions, connected to their university, but we're also talking about exploring self. So the personal narratives that they hold, the values, the interests, that kind of thing, that help shape how they see their career path and how they fit in the world. So 40% of students said that their top priority when finding a career today was finding work interesting. That was well ahead of salary concerns in 18%. 27% of students said the biggest obstacle in their future career success, though, was not knowing what field to go into. So perhaps indicating there that there is a sort of an internal sense of direction, but don't really know what those first steps might be. The sort of career confidence piece, that am I good enough, that personal confidence, career confidence. 32% of students said they are worried they're not good enough to get a good graduate job. And actually what we found with career confidence as well is it diminished as students went through their studies. So they were more confident in their first year, and as they moved through to their third year, became less confident. Confidence also diminished in line with family prior engagement in higher education. Gender also played a role, with female students feeling less confident than their male counterparts as well. Final one on here is just looking at those kind of opportunities around you. What opportunities are jobs and opportunities are available to students? We found that 1 in 5 students are going to Google to explore those kinds of initial opportunities. But what we also heard in the roundtable discussions, was very eloquently put on this slide here, is Google is only useful if you know what you're looking for, which is, I think, fair to true. It's like we've all experienced that in one way or shape or another. I'm going to do a little quiz for you to warm you up for the audience participation. Can anyone guess in the audience, and Handshake, you can't answer this, anyone from the Handshake team, what is the top search on Indeed? Any guesses? You can't answer, Izzy. I've already told you. Go. Close. Any other guesses? No, further off. It's actually nothing. Most people go to Indeed and just press enter and see what comes up. And that's come directly from a colleague who's come from Indeed. Is Francis here? He's not, is he? Right. And so this is one of the themes that came up in the roundtables as well, was like information overload for students and for careers professionals in some cases as well. And when you think about going to Indeed and just pressing enter, I mean, that's one sure way to get information overload, isn't it, to be fair? But when you think about, certainly at Handshake, what we think about is when students are in that exploration stage, when you're trying to look for opportunities and understand self, that's really when careers education, information and guidance can have the most impact. It has impact at any point in that cycle, that career journey. But at that point, that's when it's going to have the most impact. So we want to try and create a community where when students are doing those exploration stages or in that exploration stage, that careers professionals alongside them are exploring that with them alongside employers as well. So that's how we try to sort of think about that exploration stage. And if students are going to Google, how do we bring them back into the environment where you as a group of professionals are there to support them? When we move on to sort of how students are thinking about getting connected, career is made up of 1,000,001 different relationships and different connection points along the way. So how are students thinking about getting connected for professional mentoring, for advice, connecting to career professionals? 18% of students said they would turn to their career service for information on how to connect with employers and professionals. But actually, interestingly, they would turn more to lecturers for mentoring opportunities. We've already seen in the sector a phenomenal rise in the kind of mentoring opportunities that are run by career services throughout the UK, but how do we scale those kinds of opportunities for students to have those experiences? At Handshake, we talk a lot about the idea of horizontal platforms and networks and vertical platforms and networks. So LinkedIn, for example, is a horizontal network. It is used broadly across lots of different industries. It's used by people at lots of different stages in their career. But when something becomes widely adopted, you play to the biggest common denominator. And that can mean that individual sets of users' needs get forgotten. And then you start to see a rise of specific networks like Albright, for example, which is a female-only digital networking platform, or Stack Overflow, which is designed specifically for engineers. And at Handshake, we really believe that we need to create a network specifically for students and graduates because there are different needs there. When you go into LinkedIn, it can feel like a network for people who already have a network. So how do you create a space for students to start to build out those professional networks, again, with those careers professionals and employers alongside them? This piece around more easily getting connected to community, but also to the digital student experience, came through quite a lot in the roundtables as well. In particular, there was a sort of message from employers or a key theme from employers who were sort of indicating that their interactions in that early engagement or exploratory stages would be less time-bound, so less focused around the milk round of old, and more continuous involvement in that kind of exploratory stage. I think certainly from my perspective, I don't know how the rest of you feel, but in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, I would say I've really seen a diversification of employer engagement activities when working with career services, but also a diversification of the type of team members that they bring on campus. It's not just the recruiters anymore, it's recent graduates, it's actually leaders in the business as well. And I think that's a really positive step in the right direction. So how do we create, again, systems and communities that facilitate that, essentially? So the final one here is that kind of transition to work. So moving from the education community that the universities have worked so hard to make you feel a part of to your first workplace community. And how do you do that? So 90% of students said they would turn to their career service first for advice on CV and applications. That rose to 21% for interviews and assessment centres, which is interesting. 34% of students said that more opportunities to use more self-directed learning and stuff they could do in their own time would encourage them to engage more. Student engagement, as you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear, was a common challenge across all of the careers professional discussions that we had. But interestingly, on the student side, there was a real eagerness to engage. There was a real willingness and a desire to engage more with the career service. So we did do a bit of research into trying to understand what would encourage them to engage more. Personalization, so more personalized opportunities and advice was one of those drivers that would encourage students to engage more with their career service and their university. And I think this kind of speaks to the information overload piece as well. I think there's some real opportunities here to personalize some of that service provision to stop that information overload that students are feeling. And lastly, but by no means least, 71% of employers said that they are looking to create a stronger sense of belonging, really, in that kind of early talent community, because essentially they're worried about retention. And actually, universities have been doing this and been working on this for a long time. How do you create that sense of community and belonging? I think there's a real interesting opportunity there for collaboration and sharing best practice as students transition from that education community to that first workplace community. How do we make that transition more seamless and more comfortable for students? Because it's jarring in many ways. Collaboration was definitely the overarching theme of all of the research, the kind of benefits of all of it, a willingness to do more of it. And certainly from a technology partner perspective, that's something that we at Handshake think we need to do even more of. We need to do these types of events. We need to listen to the needs of the sector, and we need to evolve to meet those needs and work in partnership with you to design those needs. I don't know that we've done enough of that historically, so I hope the future looks like a more genuine partnership and moves beyond that kind of service provision piece to generally kind of challenge the status quo and bring more inclusive solutions to students, to employers, and to career professionals as well. So with that in mind, as you go through the activities this afternoon, do have a couple of questions that I'd love for you just to keep in your mind from a Handshake perspective. We've obviously been thinking about these, and we have some ideas about how we can deliver against some of these, but in the interest of partnership, curiosity, and learning from each other, I would love to kind of hear different people's perspectives on some of these questions as well. So the first one is, how can careers professionals become more visible and accessible in a world where some students do default to Google first? And for us, that is a lot about making sure that the content and the work that you create is SEO optimized, and that we open up some of those ways that, so if a student goes to Google, they come back to that community and that space where their careers professionals and employers are. How is technology supporting universities to deliver scalable, personalized digital student experiences? Again, for us, that's about utilizing things like machine learning to personalize that digital student experience, but doing it in a way that has students exploring kind of phase in mind. So when we build our algorithms, we purposely flaw them so that you don't, if you say you're looking for accounting in Aberdeen, you don't forever be just shown accounting in Aberdeen, because you're exploring. You need to be challenged and exposed to other things as well. And the last is technology supporting careers professionals and universities with actionable data to understand the needs of students? And if it's not the case today, what needs to change? And when we think about this, we think about dynamic data about career interests or values, not just static points in time that data's been collected and then you don't look at it again for 12 months. It's also about looking at engagement, not just with the university and careers professionals, but engagement with employers as well. How is a student truly interacting with their career, and how is that data then being shared back with the people that can help them if they need help? So that's how we're kind of thinking about those pieces. But I would love to hear your thoughts on some of these throughout the day. Come and grab me afterwards if you have got any particular points on any of these questions, or pop them into the Slido. But with that, I will hand back to Debbie to kick us off for our discussions and debates.
So, Fanny, I want to come to you first, as the student among us. One of the things that came out of our student roundtables was students saying, yes, we want a bit more emphasis on that support at that exploratory stage, before we kind of know what industry we want to go into, before we're ready to make connections with employers in a specific area. We just need to figure out, what does it mean to be a student who is thinking about their career in the future? And of course, one of the recommendations that often comes out of projects like these is we just need to get students to engage earlier in the journey. And the sort of sense was that kind of like, we're not sure what engagement means at that stage. So can you kind of help us understand a little bit what that sort of early stage where you're kind of perhaps you're starting your course, you're expecting perhaps the course to bring you new information and new insight about who you might become in the future. You're not ready to kind of commit to anything yet, or perhaps have a conversation with a career support professional who might be kind of helping you. Like what sort of conversations do you want to be having at that stage, and particularly where does that sit in terms of the course that you're studying?
The kind of one-on-one contact with careers advisors can become very useful, but when you're at that stage where you don't really know even the skills or like what kind of field you might be interested in, because not many people these days who do a degree end up in the exact same field at the end of their degree. And I think it's very important that it's accessible to students to understand what their options are, whether it's personalized or interactive. Some of the stuff that Claire's talked about is there, but I think that's in the exploration stages. That's the important thing, that when students are ready to engage with this topic, that it's there and it's available for them.
Katie, careers professionals will say, we work really closely with academics to shape the curriculum, and of course that is true. To what extent do you see that sort of the student journey that was mapped out, that Claire described, where you've got that exploratory stage, you've got that making connection stage, and then you've got that transition stage? To what extent is that yet reflected in academic curriculums, and what more is there to do?
I think the answer is there's quite a lot more to do. I suppose what I would say is, employability in the curriculum or engaging with academics to be more in the curriculum, I think is the coming thing. There are a number of universities who have done it. I think people are talking about it. Some places are further on, but we're not at that mass point where there's a lot of experience over several years of it being done. So don't think the sector knows what that looks like, as what good looks like yet. And one of the things we're doing at Goldsmiths, the University of London, is amazingly, actually, in a way, partly because of the significant challenges of our student cohort, who it's been recognised are not ready and are not necessarily successfully transitioning as what it is to be a student effectively, through no fault of their own, but through what they bring when they come, is we've been offered the opportunity for a quarter of the first year programme, 30 credit module and 15 credits in second year, to be around the general area of academic and careers and employability, personal growth. Now, that's an amazing thing to be handed, but it's quite a responsibility. And one of the things we've been looking at is more recent research, very recent research, around how the sense of belonging and the sense of how you develop as a young person is, you can't necessarily expect them to be engaging in careers before they've engaged with, I'm a successful student. So actually some of the practical things, like how do you actually do research when you come to uni, and how do you find out about stuff, and how do you present on it and articulate your ideas, and how do you take feedback and make it work for you? So I think that may be the core of where it's at. Now, they're quite new ideas even for us at Goldsmiths, but I think there's a lot of really good research out there now that will help us to engage with academics in maybe an academic language, because that's kind of what you need. But getting into the curriculum, I think, is the heart of it, because that's where you get equity as well, because everybody will be able to engage with it. But it can't be just a standalone, here's an employability module, everybody do it at the same time, it's exactly the same for everyone. It's got to be adaptable, and it's got to allow students time to explore and recognise that there's no right answer and it's okay to not know. So I think there's talk about it, there's thinking about it. Some universities are getting there. Some universities have done it for a couple of years, but most places you're at that sort of exploratory stage, I think. So there's a long way to go. But I think we're maybe more open to it, and maybe some of the government drivers, around the benchmarks for graduate outcome survey and things like that may push that along.
Yes, and nobody loves the kind of that sort of intense metricized emphasis on outcomes, but it's definitely focusing minds. I think it's fair to say. Yes, some emphatic nods there from the audience. Stephen, obviously employers broadly care about what's in the curriculum, but primarily what they want is kind of skilled graduates, isn't it? To what extent, Claire sort of suggested that employers are kind of quite interested in perhaps getting involved at that earlier stage, and of course the payoff is that you build that relationship, and that's great. But that's quite a lot of work to expect of employers, isn't it? To be kind of being part of that picture of developing the whole person.
Yeah, and I think there's a fundamental challenge there. The first thing I would say is actually employers do go a lot earlier than they used to. I've got a bit short at the moment, but a few grey hairs. So if I go back 20 years, employers didn't talk to first years. They really got annoyed if first years turned up to events because that's not what they were concerned with. So employers do go an awful lot earlier in the cycle than they used to. But I think there is a fundamental tension that we don't talk about enough, which is that quite rightly an institution cares about all its students and all its students' outcomes. And an employer may be interested in that conversation and might be quite enlightened in helping with that. But bottom line, they've got hires to fill. And I think there's a there's a tension between those two goals. And I don't think we've cracked it yet, but it's finding out where's that sweet spot where it can be efficient for an employers to engage. Because remember, very few employers are actually in that big volume national hundreds and hundreds or over 1,000 vacancies. They get a lot of noise, but actually the actual number is very small. Probably count them on two hands. So it's trying to work all that out, and there's a danger that we overgeneralize about the graduate market. I'd also pick up on the word that you use, Katie, transitions. I was chatting to Ali just before we started, and again we're talking about transitions, and I think that's what we're talking about. It's that transition through education and into work, and it's how do we all make that process work better. And sometimes I think when it comes to dealing with academics, the word employability may not help. Sometimes when I'm talking with academics, I say, we're talking about making better academics as well. The skills we're talking about are life skills. Student life is also work. So, it does apply to that as well.
That then kind of leads us to talk about confidence and about the level of confidence students have to see themselves in particular roles, to make that transition effectively, to understand what skills that they have and to be able to articulate those. And so, Fanny, I'm curious, and without kind of, I guess, outing your particular institution, but, where does responsibility sit in an institution for developing students' confidence, and what is it that supports a kind of, I guess, a sense of belonging as you transition, as you become a graduate? How do you integrate into the workplace, and are there opportunities for institutions to help with that, and what would that look like? That's a lot of questions all at once. pick one.
Well, we might have to tackle them one by one. But I think I will out the OU. I ideally love the OU, but I think the different student profile at the OU means that there isn't perhaps as much proactive as there are at BRIC unis, which is how we call every other university in the UK. But I think you get as Steve was talking, I was thinking at the start of your module, you get this like very fancy page where it's like, these are the skills you're going to develop by the end of your module. And then at the end of your module, you may look back at it and you're like, I don't really know what I did to develop these skills. Like, I've read some content, I've written some essays, I got some marks, but it's very hard to see straight away how those translate into skills, especially when you are, 3 and with the OU, even 4, 5, 6 years into your degree. And you just keep doing these assignments and they're getting a bit tedious and you just want a degree. But I think as kind of time passes, and I think for me particularly, because I've been a student for 4 coming on 5 years now, I can kind of see how all of those have helped me in my early professional career now. But I think people, or institutions rather, expect students to be quite proactive about it sometimes. And I do think we need to treat university students as adults, as they are and as we are. But I do think there needs to be a certain level of kind of, again, as Claire said earlier, that if you're just interested in engineering jobs in Aberdeen, you do need to be challenged on that to think more widely at the start, I think.
Katie, I sort of alluded to that kind of challenge, which is that for a careers professional, not only is it now about the kind of the early stages, it's about the middle stages and it's about the end stages as well. But also you're coping with an awful lot of student diversity. And one of the things that came out of the research, and I think that it's sort of a bit irritating perhaps for careers professionals to hear, is students sort of saying, well, I'm an international postgraduate in law, and therefore I would like this really quite specific sort of service. And I suppose we could probably there's many permutations of that problem happening at different institutions around the country, and of course career services are doing their very best to kind of diversify the offer and to kind of build the kind of breadth of expertise and to offer that to students in a personalised way and all the rest of it. But given that that's the case, is there anything that career services need to stop doing that's really not adding value to open, in order to kind of make space for some of these other more challenging things?
So I love that question, because actually, without wanting to be too detailed about my own institution, there's been some challenges financially recently, and many of us have been challenged about reducing budgets. But in careers, we haven't had to reduce because it was impossible to point to anything we were doing that wasn't directly linked to the institutional employability strategy and directly linked to the university's goal of increasing our graduate outcomes. So fundamentally, they recognised that. So I don't actually think at the moment, certainly the way I operate, and I'm sure many, many heads, there isn't any fat, because what has happened is mostly career services there was expansion that happened a few years ago, but at the moment, I think we are being asked to do more and more and more with the same resources. And in fact, what you're trying to do is constantly streamline, maybe use tech where you can, to, if you can afford the tech, to create economies of scale. But I don't think there's much, once you start to go down the data route, and certainly my approach has always been, you fearlessly explore what you're doing. If you can't demonstrate that it's making a difference, then get rid of it or change it. So given that we are thinking a lot more, and so many universities have got careers registration now, and look at the impact on that and do tracking against employability learning gain and onto graduate outcomes, you're trying to demonstrate everything you do, not just overall, is making a difference. So if you ever ask us about what we look for more, it's a recognition from senior management. And wouldn't one always say this, that if you want to put your money where your mouth is, you need to fund the career service to do what you say as an institution you want to be done. If you're not bothered about graduate outcomes, and some universities are, because of the nature of their cohort, many students will be able to sail through and go off into the wide blue yonder of the wonderful 1,000+ vacancies in graduate recruiters without help at all. But it's those who need the help, and often the funding is, you're basically robbing Peter to pay Paul. So I don't think there are things to cut. I'm not saying that's the same for every institution, but I think it probably there or thereabouts.
On that data point, I mean, that's a really interesting one. Is there data that you don't currently have that would really help you to make those judgments about what's having an impact?
I don't think it's so much, is there any other data? It's having the capacity to track with the data. So I'd say the data sets, you've got graduate outcome survey, but that's a lagging indicator. You've got careers registration, which is annual, and then you've got engagement. What you really need to do is map everything together and track from the one to the other, and then relate it to individual activities as well as the broad sweep. Mm-hmm. And we're there now, but it's taken us about 3 years, and I'm lucky I've got a whole person who can do this. Most institutions, most career services don't, or some don't. So what we need is a greater understanding in the institution about the power of the data, and more than just people turning up. It's what difference does it make? That Careers Reg is the most powerful data set that's not yet fully understood by institutions.
I mean, presumably some of this is about it being understood outside the career service as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I do a lot in my institution, and many heads will be doing the same, where you are trying to demonstrate and demonstrate in a way that, so when we work, all my staff know that when they're talking to their academic colleagues, that they talk about everything you do should be moving students towards being career ready by the time they graduate. You can change your mind 1 billion times, but we know the research shows that if you're career ready by the time you graduate, it's the best indicator you're going to go on to graduate success. So what we really need is more selling from heads and all colleagues all the way up and down the institution, so that everyone follows that. And then when you're talking to students, it's about offering the opportunities that can make the difference. So you might say, if you do this particular skills award, it's going to help you be more career ready, or 3 times more career ready than if you didn't. And then you can make a choice if you want to do that or not. And if it won't be the same for everyone, but every student might then find something that appeals to them that might help them move on. I think it's about giving students the power to be able to direct their own journey, and then the confidence to feel that they can take up these opportunities. But it's more like baby steps rather than you have to decide your whole career right now, which I think is the fear.
I mean, Stephen, on that, that transition into the workplace. I mean, a lot of students will kind of, their first job, they'll have that experience, and then they'll think, actually, do you know what? This isn't the job for me, and this isn't my place, and this isn't where I belong. But what is the role then of employers of, I suppose, kind of supporting that the development of confidence and belonging, and some of the kind of like a softer side of feeling like you're becoming a professional, but also perhaps in continuing career education at that point, if someone kind of hasn't made the right choices and not kind of, I guess, then they may then go back to their institution for some support or whatever. But where do employers kind of have a role to play there?
It's quite interesting because it's something that actually over the last 12 months I've been doing a bit of thinking on and just trying to get a bit of airtime to this conversation. And because I think that sometimes, again, in that, filling vacancies, getting people onto development programs, focusing on the skills that people need to develop, how to integrate in an organization. We forget sometimes that a career journey doesn't end when you start your job. And actually, a lot of the data I look at talks about, Charlie Ball's quite interesting on this, that something that has not changed over time is there's a lot of sorting out still happens until somebody gets to about the age 30 and then they settle down. And that's probably so a lot of it is that's kind of the way my career worked. So I think there's more that we can do to increase that understanding. We were starting to talk about diversity and diverse candidates, and that's really important for diverse candidates. Gemma, I don't think, is here from Fidelity. I was talking to Fidelity, and they'd built a program very specifically diverse candidates, and particularly candidates from Black heritage, academics. Sort of, they wouldn't normally hire these candidates, and they brought them into the business on an internship that came into graduate programs. And they said the programs work really well. They've got some great people in the organisation, but they've had to work a lot harder on the career transitions. And one of the things they had to be more willing to do than they hadn't been previously with previous cohorts was let people move jobs within the organisation. So to try something and go, I'm not quite right for that, I want to go work in that department. Normally to people running graduate development programs, that can be a real pain in the backside. and there's a time and a place for it, but often it's not. So things like that. So I think there's something around understanding actually some of the dynamics of that a bit more and building that into programs and thinking, because we come back to that word transitions. It's all about making those transitions as effective as possible. Just as a quick sideline, actually, we were talking about this up in Edinburgh. I won't go down the Bobby Duffy tangents, but we were talking about actually young people do not change jobs as much as people think they do. It's a myth. And actually young people are staying in jobs longer when they graduate than they used to, for a whole bunch of reasons about adulthood, money and all that kind of stuff. And our data proves it. So our retention data. So there is something about it. It is a bit of a myth that students are flighty, your generation, and they take one job and jump out. But there is still something around actually that, for both sides, the right person in the right role is what works.
Well, I mean, Fanny, let me give you the last word then as the representative of Gen Z. If you could just speak for your entire generation, that'd be really helpful.
No pressure.
But okay, thinking about that transition into the workplace, and actually particularly about kind of the way you might use technology to I guess foster that sense of belonging, to develop your professionalism. I mean, what do you think is different, I guess, from what you've observed, but what your experience of that transition might be than, I don't know, say mine was or Stephen's was?
From an employer perspective, I don't know why I'm looking at Steve. You're not employing graduates, but I think the reality is that a lot of graduates won't go into a job where your job title is kind of like graduate, whoever you are. They will just go into kind of more entry-level positions where they essentially get stuck. If an employer has no interest in supporting the person to progress, you're expecting people to come with the skills ready to do the job, and then you're quite happy for them to keep doing that job because they're good at their job. So you kind of want to keep them at their job. The job market is very, very competitive. There aren't as many jobs as people are looking for, and I think people can often get stuck in that cycle. But I also think for my generation, in particular, I think people underestimate the challenges that we have of job security these days. Buying a house in your 20s is almost unimaginable unless you come from a really well-off background where your parents can support you. But we are trying to encourage people from all sorts of backgrounds to come into university. So they then want to kind of progress along those routes. And I think that from an employment perspective and kind of transitioning into the workplace, that's a particular challenge. If I could buy a house on like 10 years ago prices, my concerns would definitely be less. But I also think I've seen my parents be in jobs that they didn't enjoy. And I think that really resonated with me. They're getting kind of enjoyment out of your job. You don't want to. You've watched your parents grow up to a job that they really don't like doing, but it's the thing that they are skilled at, and they are often like the low skilled jobs, and you don't want to end up there because it's not pleasant.
And I suppose if you could do a job that you didn't enjoy, if you knew you were going to get paid enough to be able to buy a house, but if a house isn't in the menu, then you really better make sure you enjoy it, because it's going to be it's going to play a very different role in your life. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's a slightly bleak sense, but yeah. Okay.
To that, so I'm going back to that Bobby Duffy book again. But he says the biggest difference in generations is money. Actually, we get distracted on things that's all about social media and its values and climate change. The real difference in drives and behaviours between the generation coming through is that access to money. It dictates where you live. Do you go back home? What kind of jobs do you take, and what do you stay in? So I think there's an awful lot of academic research to back up your anecdotal thoughts.
We're going to take about half an hour. I'm going to ask you to kind of get into small groups of sort of between 4 and 6. So, the right number of people to be able to have a meaningful conversation, essentially. So you're not just kind of sort of, no freeloaders in this conversation, get tight. I'm also going to ask you just to sense check that you're not kind of sitting entirely with people from your own organisation. So do try and mix it up. And if you find that you're kind of only with friends, then maybe do a bit of switching out. I'm then going to divide the room into 3 and ask each segment to focus on a particular stage of those 3 stages of the student journey that Claire articulated. So the first stage being that kind of exploratory stage. Who am I? Who might I become? What do I want to be? What are my options? The second stage being, I need to make connections. I need to explore my options in this particular industry. I need to understand the expectations, the hidden curriculum, if you will, of this profession. And particularly, I'm going to need some quite specialist kind of career support to do that. And the third stage being that kind of transition into employment, when you're no longer kind of at your university, but you may still be kind of looking back to your university for support, and you may also be looking to your employer and looking for particular different kinds of support at that stage. I'm going to also then say, just keep some considerations in mind. One being about that kind of, I guess, the diversity of the student experience. No one student is the same as any other student, and of course you can segment that by some kind of demographic characteristics, or by kind of subjects, or by kind of stage of study, or by kind of whether they want to kind of be freelance and self-employed versus employed in industry, or whether they want to work for a small employer or big employer. There's lots of kind of axes of diversity, but just kind of bear that in mind. Another one being, of course, what technology can help with in terms of generating scale, generating efficiencies, generating data, and generating connection that might help address some of the challenges that you're kind of discussing and identifying at your particular stage of the student life journey that you're discussing. And the third being where the opportunities are for collaboration. So this is, the kind of one of the real takeaways from and this is kind of one of these very broad things. It would be great if we could all collaborate. Specifically, what is your diagnosis of where collaboration could be strengthened in some of these areas? So none of these are not questions for you to answer. These are questions for you to bear in mind. The thing we want you to do is get out your device, get yourself to slido.com and type in Careers 2032. And that is your task. So we're going to ask each group over the course of half an hour to come up with one powerful question. And by powerful question, we don't mean I'm trying to think of an example of a not very powerful question. Debbie, why are you wearing that dress? No, that's not a powerful question. Powerful question is, what does it mean to wear that dress in the 20th century? No, a question that sort of articulates a challenge. A question that sort of says, this is a really wicked problem we're all grappling with, and we don't have the answer to it. And of course, we're not going to come up with it in 20 minutes flat, just having a bit of a chat with some like-minded colleagues. But we all agree that this is something that is we're really, really struggling with, and we're really grappling with, and we will need to get to grips with if we're going to really make a success of career support in the next 10 years. So we appreciate you're not going to have the answers right away, but actually articulating that question in a way that you can all agree, and agreeing on it can actually in itself be quite powerful. We're going to ask you to come up with one recommendation. So, and in essence, actually, that might be some quite low-hanging fruit. What just needs to happen? What do university leaders need to do? What does government need to do? What do students' unions need to do? A recommendation for an actor just to do something, to change practice, to put something in place, to flick a switch, whatever it is that would just make sense to kind of move the dial in the area that you're looking at, and a request for support. So this is kind of, I guess, where that kind of collaboration point comes in. What help might you need? And I know the answer is always going to be more money, more investment. And if that's kind of what you end up with, then we will take that on the chin. But really like pragmatically as well, kind of, what would be really helpful if academics in this subject area spent some time thinking about X, Y, or actually we would really love it if we could work more closely with our students' union on student development, or etc. Or we would really love it if we could have a really good conversation with employers about that transition, whatever that kind of looks like. Feel free to kind of let your mind run riot.
So I'm Gianina, and I'm head of service at the University of Greenwich. And our powerful question is, what does transitioning mean, taking into account that students transition into study, then into internships, then into placements, maybe transitioning into postgraduates, and then into graduation?
Hi everyone, I'm Lucy from GSK. Hi.
Thanks.
Is that exploration stage really a stage, or is it more an iteration and a set of skills that you should have kind of throughout your life? And does that process really differ from when you're 18 to when you're maybe 50? Or is it kind of the same thing, and that service kind of goes away maybe for when you're a bit older?
Fantastic. That's a really high bar you've set for a powerful question. Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Hello, I'm Lizzie Darlington and I'm Director of LSE Careers. We did have a really interesting discussion about lots of things, but we've come up with a question that everyone's going to recognise, which is, how do we engage the disengaged?
Hi, I'm Claire from the University of Hertfordshire, and we have a slightly unusual, powerful question. We're asking ourselves, are we disadvantaging students by being too nice? So that is about career services offering a lot of choice that enables students to say, actually, no, I'm not going to do that at this moment in time, and opting out. So our question is, are we too nice?
Hi, I'm Helen. I'm from the Career Service in City University. We actually kind of had two questions. I'll try and say them both really quickly. So the first one, so we were talking about making connections. So our first one was around how can we help students recognise that making connections is an integral part of what they need to be doing, rather than this extra add-on thing that seems quite scary. And then the second one is, how can we leverage existing student networks, but informal ones as well as formal ones? So who are the kind of influencer students, and how can we leverage those and to help students see that they already have the networking skills, they're making networks already as students, and kind of how they can transfer that over to work, talking to employers, and maybe using that to engage them in this networking, making connections process.
My kind of, I guess, corollary question is does networking mean the same thing to each generation? Because I know for my generation, I think there's quite a lot of anxiety about being instrumental. Whereas when I speak to my younger colleagues, they're just kind of like, but we're all connected to each other all the time. I don't understand. Why are we talking about this? So yeah, I think there's some different interpretations on the idea of networking as well.
Hi everyone. I'm Hannah from Handshake, work on the university partnerships team. So employers want to know how careers are better preparing students to be more resilient in the workplace. And so that's looking ahead to 2032.
Hi, I'm Chris Lima. I'm an education consultant, and we talked about transitions. And our question is, when should we start talking about transitions so that graduates can feel confident going into the workplace? And is that at the start of the third year for undergraduates?
I'm going to ask each of the panelists in turn to give their one big takeaway.
I was thinking about change, being comfortable with change, and being career resilient, and having the confidence to do both. And it feels like, because I was really struck by your question around, is it the same when you're doing this at 18 as to when you're doing it at 50 or whatever? And we don't often get to see people transitioning all the way through once they've gone, a couple of years after they graduate. But I'm thinking about how many of my friends and family who I'd shown how to do, to look for career, decide on a new career, and then prepare for it, and then apply for it and successfully get it. And then watching them do it 5 or 10 years later and thinking, why aren't they coming back and asking me exactly the same questions? But hearing from what they've said that they've taken on board that learning and are reapplying it. So I kind of think our biggest challenge is to teach the skills of change and being able to cope with change, and being able to, and that includes feedback, that includes thinking, how do you look at next steps, how do you explore, how do you cope with that change? And how do you keep remembering how to do that in the millions of times that one of the last questions was around all these different transitions? So I think that's what it's made me think about, is it's a lifelong process. So the skills are about managing that. It's sort of quite meta.
Having done 3 of these now, so I've done 3 of these sessions and they've all been really interesting and they've all different things have come up. And I think, so what I'm going to say reflects on actually my thoughts from listening to all of these sessions. I guess it's where the ISE sits in this and why we were keen to support this piece of work. And I think there's a sweet spot where the strategic goals of employers, the strategic goals of universities, the needs of students, there's a sweet spot where those strategies meet operational delivery. And sometimes we've got our heads down in delivery. Sometimes we're a bit up in the clouds thinking about long-term strategy. If we can get those to connect and those 3 groups and get to that sweet spot where strategy meets operational delivery, that's where change happens. And I think that's where a lot of these things we're thinking about, we can start to develop those different, whatever those interventions are that make those transitions work better.
It kind of in response to what you were talking about kind of matching with employers and all the rest, that I think this, particularly the second half of this conversation and some of the questions, has even more so highlighted for me that perhaps the biggest gap is with the employers. So kind of that transitioning stage, because it sounds really nice that you go and get to know an employer. And luckily I haven't had horrible interview experiences, but I certainly know a lot of friends who have. And I think, in a way, interviews and this whole applying for jobs doesn't actually assess your skills in doing the job. It assesses your skills on how to answer the 15 most frequently asked questions in selling yourself. And I think if I gave you a job description, within half an hour, anyone in this room or outside of this room could tell me the 5 questions that they're going to be asked. And it's about who can say bigger with the, you apply for an entry-level position and they're like, you need to have 5 years experience in this field to become an administrator. And I think the reality with employers is, unfortunately, very far from that position. And that concerns me sometimes, because I said earlier as well that most people don't end up in graduate jobs or with companies who are in contact with the university. Most people just go out and start applying for jobs on LinkedIn or wherever it is. And there isn't that consideration. But how do you engage or disengage was definitely the question I was going to come to. As VP Engagement, who's expected to engage with 170,000 students, I ask myself that question on a daily basis. But I think, kind of again, relating to an earlier point I made, engagement doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to students as it does to staff at universities. And I think a lot of the time to engage them it just means to be available for them for when they need you, because at the end of the day, you can't force someone to do something, but you can present it in ways that makes it more appealing to them. And there might need to be, when we talk about general engagement activities, you need to have a variety of ways to be involved. And I think the same thing applies to careers and employability.
I think there's 3 key takeaways for me. The first is what Katie was talking about in relation to career services, already moving towards sort of embedding within the curriculum for kind of equity purposes and all that kind of stuff. But your question and the transitions question I thought was really interesting about, are these the skills that we should just be teaching students about navigating career throughout the whole of their life, not just that first transition? And I think the answer to that is yes. And I think there are so many professionals in this room that have probably studied career decision-making theories. And why aren't we maybe making the tacit more explicit in some of that embedded employability work to give students those models of career decision-making as well, so they can take them forward? I know from studying them myself, they've been helpful in my own career. So maybe we need to do that, make the tacit explicit in the curriculum around those career decision-making pieces. I think the second one is go back to that engagement piece. I think if you want students to engage, they need to feel confident and they need to feel like they belong. And the only way that we do that is by creating community and sharing our own stories, our own messy career paths and challenges that we faced. And I don't know that we've found a way to do that at scale yet. I was talking to Jim about this yesterday, but all the posters on campus of alumni are like really successful people who've gone and started their business. No wonder students get a bit paranoid that they don't know what they want to do next. Surely that just needs to change as the second piece. And then I think the third piece from a tech perspective, rather than, I suppose, more of a careers focus, is we talk about learner analytics all the time and university engagement and early sort of career engagement for employers. But I think there is a piece around career engagement. I think career registration data is fantastic. I think graduate outcomes is meh. But I think there's a question about how does tech support career services and employers to understand truly how students are engaging with their early career, whether it's applying for 50 jobs and not getting feedback from the employer, which is what we talked about over the last session. How do we close the loop in some of those places? And I think technology and networks and platforms like Handshake have a really big part to play in that. So I think we will continue to do so.